This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Once more, I'm going to ask if you're a regular listener of the podcast that you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Graceful Atheist Podcast so that others can find it. Today's episode is a deconversion, not so anonymous episode. My guest today is Amanda Holloway. Amanda is very early in her deconversion. In fact, only months in. She tells her story with rawness and honesty and humility and the joy of the freedom that she's now experiencing. Amanda also has a Me Too story, which she shares with the same honesty and rawness. Things begin to unravel for Amanda while watching the Blasey Ford testimony at the Kavanaugh hearings. Let this serve as a warning that we're about to get into some very serious topics, including sexual abuse, emotional neglect, and suicide. As you're about to hear, Amanda reached out for help, and I commend her for her bravery and just encourage anyone who's listening to this podcast who needs some support and help, reach out if you need help. We'll have links in the show notes for suicide prevention, as well as some other resources for going through the deconversion process. As you listen to Amanda's story, do notice the new joy that she has and the new acceptance that she feels from her loved ones and her general sense of relishing life. And with that, I give you Amanda Holloway. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dave. Thank you so much.
Amanda, I usually start with people's religious background when we're doing a Deconversion Anonymous episode, but I understand a little bit of your story. I want you to tell us, but it sounds like you have to begin at the beginning and what your life was like before Christianity. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, so I was raised by a single mom. I grew up knowing only one sibling. My growing up was very erratic, I guess. There wasn't much consistency to it. So I was raised by a single mom, and it was a very inconsistent, rocky childhood. I went to 5 different elementary schools, and that really put me in an isolating place in life. As a little girl, I didn't have friends. I didn't have really anyone to fall back on. And in addition to that, my sister and I had different dads. I didn't find out about my sister and I having different fathers until I was 7.
Wow.
The only reason why my mom told me is because my sister's father, I'm not going to say his name. My sister's father, he was trying to get custody of my sister. So only by necessity did my mother tell me, "Oh, this man is not your father."
Wow.
Yeah. So that was like really, obviously I didn't realize it then, but now looking at myself, that was really traumatizing. It put me in a very uncomfortable situation because even after the custody thing ended, I continued to go to his house on the weekends, like every other weekend, like my sister's custody agreement was. My mom,
Okay.
I guess they agreed that I would also go. So then it was like, well, what do I call you? And it was just really uncomfortable. I also was sexually abused by my sister's dad, which I didn't remember until I was about 21. And so that had a huge impact on my story. Yeah, it had a huge impact on my story. And again, it just isolated me from everyone. I just felt like such a black sheep, such an outcast in my family, in school, everywhere. So
Yeah. Wow. And I understand part of your story as well as just when you tried to tell your mom about this, that didn't necessarily go well.
Yeah, so I had already been a Christian at that point. And so I remembered the episodes that happened when I was 21 at a women's ministry luncheon. A woman had been sharing how she was being abused by somebody in her life, and she didn't realize what it was until someone else shared their story with her. And so then that same thing happened to me, where it was like these two episodes like popped into my head, and I finally was able to like label what it was.
Mhm.
It still took me a really long time, because back then, that was like 10 years ago. Back then, molestation was like the buzzword to use around sexual abuse. And like sexual abuse, sexual assault, that wasn't really being used as much. So I knew it wasn't molestation, but I didn't know what to call it. So it was still really uncomfortable. So I found the courage to tell my mom what happened, and she demanded to know the details. And it was so raw at that point. I felt really uncomfortable. I felt really uncomfortable that this was the first question she was asking me.
Mhm.
And so I refused to give them to her. And she basically just dismissed it and was just like, it didn't happen. If I didn't want to tell her the details, it didn't happen.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. It's truly terrible. And I imagine the isolation is just devastating.
Yeah. And, being in the Christian community didn't make it any better, because it was like, I constantly felt like I needed to forgive. And at that point, I didn't realize much, like, how much toxicity and trauma I was experiencing from my relationship with my mom. But as far as like my sister's dad goes, like my sister still had a relationship with him. My mom still had not a relationship with him, but because of my sister, they weren't together or anything. So I felt like I had to have him be a part of my life. And I didn't really know that there was any other way.
So you almost felt obligated to continue the relationship?
Yeah, I felt like my mom kind of forced me, because like she gained more by having him like be a part of both of our lives, because he came from a family with money. And she would ask, not all the time, but she would ask him like for help with different things for my sister, but then also for me as an extension of that kind of.
Yeah.
So at like looking back at it at this point, like she never tried to protect me.
Yeah.
There's one or two times that she maybe tried to protect me, but really it was always like to make her look good or to benefit her.
Right. I definitely don't want to in any way imply a comparison here, but we have similar stories, although sexual abuse was not a part of my story. What is similar is a difficult relationship with my mom. She went through, in our case, it was drugs and alcohol. There were multiple people that she was either married to or who were, here's the new dad kind of thing, and really grew up with either poor or no father figures.
Right.
And so again, no comparison. And I think what another piece that's similar to us is that then we became Christians, not as children. So that's why I kind of want to go back just for a minute and let's go back
Absolutely.
to what led you into Christianity.
So my mom started taking us to church when I was like 10. And I think it was on the recommendation of a friend, because my mom actually grew up in the church, like in the Hispanic church, which tends to be extremely legalistic in every type of way, depending on which denomination that you're in. So
Yeah.
I think at one point she was like, in the Catholic, but then it went to the Pentecostal, but it was like the type that was like, you have to wear a dress to church, no makeup, like all of that. So she grew up in this like really rigid childhood, and she was in also a very abusive childhood. So I think that she was very resistant to introducing us to that. But then her friend was going to this church. Her best friend at the time was going to this church. And so I guess she felt like she wanted to instill good morals in us or whatever, but it was never because it was like part of her faith journey. She just didn't want us to go to hell or something. I don't really know.
Yeah. I mean, there's that lingering fear
Yeah.
So again, I don't want to keep making comparisons, but
no, it's totally fine.
I went to a Pentecostal church. I happen to be half Mexican. I didn't go to a Latino church. I went to a very white evangelical church.
Yeah.
But when I went to Bible college, I had lots of friends that were Latino and Latinas that went to the very kinds of churches you're describing. I visited those kinds of churches multiple times.
Yeah.
My Bible college experience was very, very legalistic, very similar. So
yeah, I thankfully didn't, like, I'm just not that type of person.
Right.
I just want to be comfortable. I just don't want to do what I want to do.
Yeah. That'll get you in trouble in the church.
Yeah. So I'm thankful that I never went to that type of church, but I can see how difficult that would make my mom's childhood. Plus the abuse. My grandfather was an alcoholic, and he was abusive and towards my grandmother, and it's just a long story, but I can see how my mom's behavior would be from her childhood. And so I'm understanding of that. But when I look at myself, I'm so like self-aware and conscious, and I don't know, intuitive, I guess, that I realize like that I have the ability to make choices that aren't based on my childhood. They're based on logic, they're based on love, they're based on like all these other things, these other conclusions.
I love the way you just phrased that. That's beautiful.
Yeah, and that's where the I guess the conflict for me comes in.
Why don't we back up just a second and let's say, so we've talked a little bit about your mother's church experience. What was yours like again? Where'd you start to go to church, and when, what did you find valuable there at the time?
So I started going to church when I was 10, and then we just went sporadically. My mom sent me to Christian summer camp a few times, and then on one of those times, I basically went to summer camp, and I was like, God, you're either going to reveal yourself to me or I'm going to kill myself. I can't do it anymore. That was like a week or two before I turned 16. And so I went to camp. This was, so at the camp, I bought a Bible, and I started reading it. I guess maybe I thought if I was going to take my faith seriously, then I needed to take my faith seriously.
Yeah.
And when I hit Romans 8:38 and 39, it was literally everything that I needed in my life at that point. Like, it was showing me God's love, and I needed that love so desperately because I hadn't found it anywhere else in my life.
Yeah.
And it saved me. Like, those verses saved me. And so I gave my life to God.
You may have to refresh my memory. Can you give us a summary of those verses?
God's love surpasses all things. No, no heights, no depths, no nothing, no angels, no demons, are greater than the love of God or whatever.
Nothing can separate you from the love of God.
So that was what I needed, and I gave my life to Jesus, crying like a day or two later, throwing away all of my CDs because the theme that week was like getting rid of something that is holding you back from God. And so, my Pink CD and my I literally bought an Eminem CD on the way to camp.
Yeah.
I threw everything away. And I was willing to sacrifice everything for my faith, my belief in God, my Christianity. It was really difficult.
I can tell just from talking to you that you took this very seriously. I think one of the things that as we experience deconversion, we often have the believers who remain in our lives who question whether we were ever real Christians. But I think you've demonstrated just in your discussion, how seriously you took it, right?
Yeah, I take everything very personally. That's just the type of person I am. I do everything with my whole heart.
Yeah. And so when did you start to have some doubts?
So that was like 2 weeks before I turned 16. I think the next summer, maybe 2 summers after that, I went to Creation, which is a huge Christian music festival.
Okay.
They have one in Pennsylvania, and I think they might have a few other ones, but it's basically like they call it Woodstock for Christians.
Right.
You go camping, like it's
Yes.
so this big thing. So I went with some, like, a friend, and they went with some other friends, and so this at one point there was this guy who I guess had like some kind of addiction lifestyle, and so people were praying over him, and they were praying in tongues. And I was like, what?
Yes.
Why don't I understand what they're saying? I was so confused.
Seriously.
So then I started asking like my youth pastor about it, and he didn't know. So he just was like, this isn't something that we talk about.
Yeah.
I was like, that isn't, even at that age, I was like, that's not how you answer somebody's question. Like,
right.
So it made me angry, and so I started researching it. And then I went to a very conservative Christian college in Missouri for 1.5 years. And that made that whole part, like figuring out that whole belief, even more, like, I guess, important to me, because so it was a Christian, the Christian church. It's like a denomination. They call them, like, they think they're the only Christians or whatever.
Right.
So it was a Christian church college, and they don't believe in tongues or gifts or anything like that. They're cessation or whatever.
Yes.
So there were people. So there was like all these fights all the time about tongues and gifts and all this stuff. And like, I had this dude tell me that I would go to hell if I prayed in tongues.
No.
And I was like,
that's terrible.
That's not God. Like,
yeah.
Because if I made a mistake like that, like, God would forgive me. So even that early in my faith, like, I was like, this is not right that there's so much conflict in the church. And then and those type of questions kept happening, like the whole like snakes thing.
Yeah.
How there's people who believe like snakes, whatever, they can bite you and God is going to heal you.
Right.
It's in the Bible.
It's in Mark.
Yep. It? Like, if we're Pentecostal, why aren't we believing this? So I asked my pastor, and he's just like, pray about it and God will answer you. I'm like, that's not an answer. Like, it's like in the Bible. Why aren't we letting snakes bite us? It's in the New Testament. Like, so, I mean, to me, it's like common sense, because I took things so literally, which I just found out. I just found out that people don't take, that some denominations see the Bible as allegory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a really common theme, though, I think, for people that go through either deconstruction or full-blown deconversion, is that it's the people who took the Bible very seriously. It's when you really take it seriously that it starts to implode on itself, right? It starts to fall in on itself. Yeah. And that seems to be your experience there. You were really asking the right questions. Here it is, black and white. This is what it says.
Yeah.
Why is it? So I think that's very, very common.
Yeah. So then after that, I got married. Well after that, I got married. And we kind of, I became a credentialed minister with the Assemblies of God and that was for a year.
Okay.
But my husband and I had been sinning before we got married.
Oh no, I won't tell anybody if you don't.
So I had all of these complexes that were happening because of this situation. And I'm realizing now how toxic it was. I didn't realize it then. I just thought that my husband and I were wrong.
Right.
But, we had sex for the first time, and then it was like, we have to confess our sins.
Right.
So he told his pastor, I told my pastor, we told our friends. And then it was like a free-for-all. Everybody gets a decision on how we proceed with our lives. And so that was really hard too. And it took me a really long time. It probably took me until my kids were born, like 3 years later, to really feel like, no, we didn't do the wrong thing. And my kids are a product of that now. And so then once my kids were born, I had really bad anxiety. We stopped going to church. And then maybe like 2 years ago, we started going to church again. We started being more involved. We are going to this church that's part of the Assemblies, but they don't have any Holy Spirit, like no tongues, no gifts. And it's honestly like its own little cult. And so after we had been going there for like 9 months, we were like, well, we can't do this. Like, the Holy Spirit is part of the Trinity. So if that's not present, then we're not really worshiping God the way that we should be.
Mm-hmm.
So then after that, we went to what I like to call a very super Pentecostal church. That was also part of the Assemblies, but it was a church of about like 500 or 700 people. That was actually like different campuses, so it was broken up over like 8 or 9 campuses, and they were like very fervent and miracles and prophecy, and the guy who started the whole thing was an apostle and
self-proclaimed, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, well, because his thing, it's so convincing, like, and they believe it themselves, so it's hard to not like be a part of it. But he had other people confirm that he was an apostle, and his thing was like validation, like you must be validated and God must validate you via other people, and we must validate each other. And like, I needed that so badly. Like, I needed to felt like I was being heard and that somebody was seeing me and hearing me, which was the theme for my whole life. So then I just started to like, our marriage was like falling apart. So last June we moved, and my husband and I had been working opposite schedules for all 3 years of my kid's life. And so then we moved, and he started a new job, and we were finally on the same schedule and all of that, but our marriage was falling apart like so bad.
Right.
And in October, this past October, I just like had a mental health breakdown. The whole Judge Kavanaugh thing.
Yeah.
The questioning and the testimony, and the Christine, what's her name?
Christine Blasey Ford, Dr. Ford.
Yeah. That actually sent me into like panic attacks. So because of my mom denying that my sexual abuse happened, I really identified with what was going on.
Yeah.
And people in my church like had an opinion on whether this woman was actually like telling the truth or not. Like, that is not your place to have an opinion. And so I just started falling apart and having panic attacks like randomly, and having flashbacks like while I'm driving. And so I told my husband like multiple nights this one week, like, I'm not okay. I'm not okay. I'm not okay. And finally, he heard me, which is hard sometimes for a man to hear, like really hear. But he heard me and was like, do you want to get help? And I was like, yes, I need to get help, because I had been trying to go to therapy, but my son had been in the hospital. It's like this whole thing. So I tried to go to the ER the next day, but because I wasn't suicidal, they just sent me home. And then I started an outpatient program. So then I started an outpatient program. And then a couple of days later, just having the time to think about things, not having to go to work. I mean, I still had to help take care of my children, but it gave me the space to like really think about things. And also we were still fighting.
Okay.
And so I became suicidal at that point. And I went to the program that morning and I saw the psychiatrist and I told him I wanted to kill myself, and they sent me to inpatient hospitalization.
Yeah.
And I spent a weekend there. And so at inpatient hospitalization, it kind of just hit me like, God is not here. And when I was going through all that stuff, all these fights with my husband, I thought that my husband was being abusive towards me. We were really being abusive towards each other because I had no idea how bad my mental health was. But I texted our pastor and was like, I think that I'm being abused. And she was like, you shouldn't let that happen.
Wow. That is a terrible response.
Yeah. And so like when I was in the hospital, it gave me time to think. It gave me time apart from things. And so that was like the really big kind of catalyst. And it was still kind of a progression after that, which I can keep like talking about that, but that being hospitalized and having help and getting medication, having clarity of mind finally was like the biggest weight off my shoulders to my deconversion.
Wow. That's an incredible story. And I think the first thing I want to highlight is your bravery in asking for help. You know, I definitely will put in the show notes some suicide hotlines for people. If you listeners that are out there, if you're going through anything that gets you to the point where you're questioning your own life, you need to reach out for some help, just like Amanda has. And just again, I commend you for your bravery in doing that. And I'm glad you're with us still.
Yeah. Thanks.
So after the inpatient starting to question whether, you know, God was available to you when you were reaching out to him, and kind of what were the next things that happened?
So after, you know, you get out of inpatient, then I continued the day program, and it was just like, I could finally see all of these human beings that were really awesome human beings, but not Christians.
Yeah.
And I could finally value them instead of dismissing them. And so then after my inpatient was done, I continued therapy, and it was a lot of stuff about my mom.
Yeah.
I hadn't talked to my mom from probably the end of October, and now we're like approaching like December. And my therapist is like really big on getting your feelings out and like writing letters, even if you don't give them, but just like get all your feelings out. So I had been writing these letters to my mom that I hadn't sent. And finally one day, because I'm an all or nothing person, it's part of my DNA.
Yeah.
I wrote her a letter and I sent it. And I was not nice. I was very firm, and I made myself very clear, and I didn't give any options on, you know, if you want to talk about, I basically just put everything in her court, because I knew that she wouldn't really take it seriously, or she wouldn't really respond like appropriately. Right. So there was that. A few weeks after that, I watched, there's these docs which you can also probably link, but
Sure.
It's called Exodus Stock.
Okay.
So like Exodus, like the book of the Bible, DOC, and that those are films produced by a friend of a friend, and they're people telling their deconversion stories. And so listening to these, I finally felt like I finally felt okay, like I can let this go. Other people have done it. All of the things that they said like make sense. Like why would we believe in a God who allows children to starve to death, but then football players with multi-million-dollar contracts to praise him?
Right.
That's total bullshit. Like I cannot do this anymore. I cannot do it. So being the all or nothing person that I am, I went home and I looked at my husband in the eye and I said, I don't think I'm a Christian anymore.
Wow. What was his response?
He was like, I still love you. And I'm like, okay.
That is the right response. Good.
He was like, aren't you worried about like if you're going to go to hell? And I'm like, no, I don't have time to worry about that. I have too many things going on in my life for that to be my first concern. I have to focus on myself right now. I can't think about eternity anymore. So, we still, like, he considers himself a Christian still. We're not going to church, but I did tell him, like, I'll go to church with you if you want, because I'm the one that has changed and I want to honor you and I want you to know that I love you. And, you know, if he felt like that was important for our kids too, I'm kind of on the fence about that, but he's just like doing his own thing, and I'm doing my thing, and he doesn't really feel like the pressure to go to church right now. So
again, our stories are very, very similar. So my wife is very much a believer, and my kids as well. And I often go to church with them because, again, you've said it beautifully. You know, I'm the one who changed and I love them. And so that's important to them. And so I'm going to back them up on that. And I think one mistake that people do make when they go through the deconversion process is they're so angry. There's so much emotion. There's so much intensity of these emotions that you can burn bridges with people who you truly care for. And so one of the things I talk about a lot is the relationships are more important than the ideology.
Yeah.
And so you want to maintain those relationships through this transition you're going through. It sounds like you've done just a beautiful job of that.
Yeah, I've tried to take, like, disconnect myself from my feelings a lot because I'm very angry. I have a lot of student loans that I cannot pay. You know, and my husband and I make a decent income, and it's the burden is so great. And I'm very, very, very angry about it.
Yeah. Absolutely. You're totally valid to have those emotions. The emotions come and they're going to be there, and you're going to be angry.
Absolutely.
Whether it's about your student loans or whether it's about God failed me, right?
Yeah.
Or I've lost my best friend. You know, like the emotions are very real and very valid.
Yeah. So, but the one thing that I've been like trying to talk to myself about is just, you don't have to de-evangelize people. Like, you don't have to convince anyone. You can just be what you are. You can figure out what you believe, and everybody can have their own beliefs. Like, my husband is like super into mountain biking, and I'm finally okay with him having something that he enjoys that's not me, because I used religion to manipulate and guilt and shame him so badly. And I deeply apologized to him when I realized that. I'm ashamed of my behavior as a Christian woman because I felt like it had to be a certain way, when I, in the last few weeks, have been trying to like figure out what I believe. He's been open to me talking to him about that. So, which obviously these are very controversial topics, but fostering children, abortion,
So the easy things is what you mean.
Because it's just like, if I don't believe in the Bible and I don't believe what Christians believe anymore, what do I believe? So I've been just like talking to him about this, and he's been listening, and he's been understanding, and he's been so open and not mad and not angry and not trying to convince me of anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him, like, your ability to just love me and not love me for what I believe or whatever it's been just like the best learning experience. And I just feel so accepted and loved by him. And I'm getting to know a part of him I couldn't get to know before because I was too Christian.
Yeah, no, I completely hear you.
To experience it. Like, I didn't realize how open and loving and whatever, because I just was trying to force him to be the certain type of husband that he wasn't.
Man, just a couple of things I had to react to. One is just the sense of obligation that you felt to live up to some external ideal of what marriage ought to look like or what have you. I think is just destructive. I imagine that there are thousands, millions of people that struggle with that, especially within the Christian context. And then two, you've described beautifully, this idea that I hammer home all the time is about secular grace. And all I mean by that is that our connection with our loved ones, our friends, our family, the people who we care about and who care about us, that is the meaning in our life. That is the powerful, awe-inspiring, belonging connection that we've been looking for. And I think you've said it so well that it took you leaving Christianity to see the love from your husband and to truly feel accepted. I think that's just beautiful.
Yeah. I can't believe that, like, I've discovered all these things, but I'm so grateful for the journey.
Yeah, that's amazing. I guess my next set of questions would just be for the people that this is very new for you, right? You're what I call a baby, not a Christian, or baby, not a theist. Right? This is brand spanking new. You mentioned kind of reevaluating what are the things that you do believe. How is that process going, and what standard are you using to try to figure that out?
So I think that every ex-evangelical or deconverted Christian says this to themselves, but within like a day or two of me saying the words that I'm not a Christian anymore,
Mm-hmm.
I ask myself, can I be a moral person? Like,
yeah, it's a valid question.
and then I asked myself, which this is valid for anybody who I see myself as ridiculous, but this is valid for anybody who has this question. But my second question to myself was, am I even a heterosexual? Like,
mm-hmm.
Because I've never been able to ask myself these questions.
Right.
And so, like, I deeply love my husband and all of that, but I just was like, I've never been allowed to just, experiment or open these questions or whatever.
You're discovering who you are as a person without the constraints.
Right. I am not putting pressure on myself because I've already had enough pressure to like try to figure out what I believe in my life. And so I'm just being okay with not believing anything right now.
Right.
And I think that that's a really important part of deconstruction. And, some people might have that and some people might not have that. They might, go straight into being an atheist and straight into like all of these things. I'm just trying to be really patient because not only am I going through a deconstruction, I'm trying to get through all this trauma that I experienced throughout my life in religion, in my home life, in like all of these ways. And so I'm just telling myself, because there are times where I'm like start feeling panicky, like because I don't know what I believe. And then in those moments, I'm just saying to myself, like, you don't have to believe anything right now.
Right.
I met up with a friend who she kind of grew up in the church, but never really like believed. And she said to me, which I never thought of this before. She was like, even if you decide that you believe something today, you can change your mind.
Mm-hmm.
But as a Christian, you can't change your mind. Like,
that's right.
This is what you believe. And so that to me, again, was like the whole grace for myself. Like, you're allowed to believe something today and not believe it tomorrow. You're allowed to believe nothing and then tomorrow decide you believe something. And it's just okay. So like, yeah, I listen to different kinds of, you know, atheist talks or whatever. I've been trying to do some research, but I'm just trying to be and heal and listen to other people's stories and all of that.
Yeah, and again, that's extremely well said, right? You are free now to respond to the evidence, as it were, around you and make up your own mind. And maybe new evidence will present itself at some point, and you're free to change your mind. And that is this incredibly freeing feeling and experience.
Yeah.
I don't really care much about the labels, but do you have a sense of, would you call yourself an agnostic? Do you have a label that you assign to yourself?
I think I would definitely call myself an atheist at this point, although I keep kind of going back to, like, I prayed all these prayers, like, where did they go? And I had all these thoughts that I felt like I was communicating to God. And I'm finding a lot of like peace and strength in realizing that all of those prayers and thoughts I was praying to myself, and I was encouraging myself. And so that kind of like, okay, well, maybe I'm my own God because of that. I had a friend that I got into a little argument with, basically. She's trying to keep me religious.
Yeah.
Who said, well, if you believe in, good and evil, then you have to believe that there's a creator of those things, blah, 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 whatever. But yeah, I mean, I would say atheist, or whatever being your own God is. I don't know. I don't even know if there's a word for it or not.
Interesting. I hear you. I had Matt Cook on a few episodes ago, who he's very much a humanist, very much an atheist, but he practices prayer, right? He knows he's talking to himself. That's meaningful for him. So it's also perfectly valid or meditation. That was the previous episode with Andrew. All those things are, the reason they exist in human culture is that they provide some value to some people some of the time. And so those are perfectly valid things to continue to practice if that's what you want, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any resources, any specific things that either of you read, or a podcast or YouTube channel? And I'm not fishing here for me. Things that you've consumed that you found helpful.
Yeah, I definitely highly recommend the Exodus doc that I mentioned before. It was just very well done and very it wasn't really in your face at all.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're only going to be posting a few more of those. And then the Voices of Deconversion has been, Steve is just so gentle and calm, and he listens and he's understanding, and he asks really, really thoughtful questions. I listened to your podcast a few times, and I'll continue to do that. I joined, like, I'm a Facebook group junkie, and that's been like forever. So I joined Recovering Ex-Christians. I joined there's an ex-evangelicals group. There's a bunch of other groups. I don't actually have a local group. There's one that's like maybe like in 45 minutes away. So I'm trying to get people that are in my area, because I'd really love to have a meetup.
Yeah.
So if anybody is in Reading, Pennsylvania.
Definitely. I think that's the huge gaping hole that we have to fill still, is that, we've lost our community from our religious background, and we connect with each other online, but as good as that is, it's still not what we need as human beings, right? We need full blown in the same room with one another connection. And yeah, I totally encourage you to seek that out. And again, if somebody is listening in Reading, Pennsylvania, get in touch. I'll be the email connection if you need that.
Yeah, absolutely. So those are pretty much it. Get a therapist.
Big shout out to therapists. Yes.
Yeah, I cannot recommend that enough. It's really interesting because right before my son went in the hospital, I knew that I was like having these issues, and I decided I'm not going to see a Christian therapist. I need an outsider's perspective. And it was the best decision. I love my therapist so much. We have such a good relationship,
Yeah.
and she has no idea about Christianity, and it's amazing because she like asked me all these good questions.
Yeah.
Like the other day I mentioned iron sharpens iron. She had no idea what that meant. And I didn't know that normal people didn't know what that meant.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, we have our own language. We had our own language. Yeah.
Yeah, and even the girl that I mentioned before who, like, at least she went to church growing up, she didn't know what it was. And I was like, what?
That's
so
too funny.
weird.
So, Amanda, for those people who are hearing your story, either who maybe have had sexual abuse in their past, or they're beginning to question or in the process of deconstruction, deconversion, what's your advice for them? What would you have them do?
Just know that you're not alone. Somebody else might not have an identical story, but once you start building your community, you'll find several people that can identify with different parts of your story. Don't be afraid to reach out and make friends. Once I got into that recovering ex-Christian groups, didn't take me very long to, post like, hey, I really need a friend. And then if people were like liking my stuff or commenting, sending them a message and saying like, hey, can we be friends?
Yeah.
I know that for, introverted people, stuff like that is really scary. But this one girl in particular, she was so grateful that I did that because she's that type of person. That's the type of person I am.
Yeah. If I can just, plug that as well, reach out. If you feel comfortable doing that, reach out to the people online or what have you, and start to try to build relationships because, again, that we need each other. That's great.
I'm on Twitter. I have a blog. I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook group I created for my area, which has like 4 people in it right now. So I just like seeing that there are Christians who are willing to kill themselves rather than like figure out that this whole thing is just a fairy tale. It's just heartbreaking. Or like destroy their lives with alcohol and addiction and sexual misconduct and all of that. Like just instead of just let it go, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's so much better to just be honest and just face the truth in the eyes instead of trying to hide from it. Addiction is a real thing. My husband is an addict, and so I understand that, but there's so many better things that you could be doing.
Absolutely. It's almost like the truth will set you free. Amanda, do you have anything that you want to add?
So the one thing I just wanted to add was that part of my deconversion story was realizing that I had clung to Christianity so hard because it was completely opposite of how my mom was. So when I realized that was also like another catalyst point where it was like, it finally freed me to not have to believe because I became all of these things on my own because I don't believe there is a God. And my mom had nothing to do with that. She used to, make me feel horrible that I said basically that God raised me. And now that after I got cut the connection with her in my life, then I was finally able to say I clung to Christianity because it was completely opposite from my mom. And now that my mom's not in my life, I can let it go.
Well, Amanda, I have to just tell you how impressed I am with your story, with how early on this is for you. It's an amazing amount of self-awareness, self-honesty, honesty with your husband. And I think that is the path forward. Really just an amazing story. I hope that people find it as inspiring as I have. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Some final thoughts on the episode. I'm amazed at Amanda's wisdom after just a few months after deconversion. She seems to be asking all the right questions. The part of her story where she describes being accepted by her husband and what felt to her like the first time in a real way without the constraints of Christianity, I think that was just an amazing story. As well as learning who she is as a person without the expectations of Christianity, or what her marriage could be without the expectations of what that is supposed to look like, or the sense of obligation of living up to some external standard. Amanda, I want to thank you for being on the podcast and commend you for your bravery. You reached out in a time of need, and that takes guts. I want to encourage anybody who's listening to this podcast, if you find yourself in a moment of need, reach out. There are people who can help. We'll have links in the show notes for various resources that you can use. And finally, I want to thank the men and women who work in this space in deconversion and deconstruction to help people along that path. A shout out to Steve Hilliker and the Voices of Deconversion podcast that helped Amanda, as well as the Exodus doc that documents deconversion stories. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Micaiah Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.